Egg freezing for most people is not about planning a future career, making a decision to do this for some sort of ambition. Every woman is telling me the reason she's freezing her eggs is because she's...
Dr. Marcia Inhorn is a professor of anthropology and international affairs at Yale University and the author of Motherhood on Ice.
82% of the women I interviewed were doing egg freezing single. There was a bit of panic about, how am I going to be a mom?
We have this notion on one hand that women don't want to settle for a lower level partner to raise children with, but then on the other hand they have this clock ticking and telling them you have to do it kind of now because in 5 years you no longer will be able to.
I would sometimes ask women, well, would you consider going out with somebody who wasn't educated or had a nice job as an electrician or a plumber? And some women said, I just couldn't conceive of being with somebody who had never been to college. I mean, really? I don't expect anything positive reproductively in the Trump administration.
We are talking abortion, right, in cancer.
Embryos, IVF, contraception. It's all up for discussion, and it's a really scary time for women.
Welcome to Do Not Disturb, the Inside Story. I'm your host, Simona Devta. Such a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm so happy you're here. We already did a lot of research calls for this season of our podcast, and fertility and egg freezing. And this topic is definitely something women want to talk, want to discuss, want to have the information for. One of our guests who is coming later in the season, she said, this should have been taught in school, you know. I had to go and dive into it all by myself, and I felt so lonely and so unsupported. So that made me feel like how great it is to have you as a guest today. What's a surprising fact about egg freezing most people don't know?
I think it's the main surprise for me in my study, which we'll be talking about. Egg freezing for most people is not about planning a future career planning, education, making a decision to do this for some sort of ambition. Egg freezing is about the problem of reproductive partnership. Really talented, educated women being unable to find a life partner to build a family with.
For me, it was also very surprising when we spoke during our research call, and I prepared a lot of questions on this topic. I remember we touched on 3 E's, and we will tell all about it to our listeners. But before we dive into this topic, I usually like to talk to the guests to understand your early life and how you came to this moment and how you ended up in this topic in the first place. So we wanted to know, what drew your attention to anthropology and reproductive studies in the first place?
Yeah, as an American woman, I was very lucky to have my first anthropology course in high school. In my senior year of high school, I had an elective. I liked it so well that when I went to university, I was going to be a journalist, and I did a journalism major, but I kept taking anthropology courses one after the other, and I became a double major between journalism and anthropology. And there's a lot of overlap between those two fields because journalists are asking people questions, interviewing people about their lives. And basically, that's what anthropologists do as well. And I went off as a journalist for 4 years, and I was doing medical journalism, but I just decided my passion is anthropology. So I went back and got my PhD. And in graduate school, I was invited to a project in Egypt. And so I started out my career as a Middle East studies scholar. And I learned my topic of my dissertation was on infertility in Egypt and the sort of beginning of assisted reproductive technologies in the Middle East. You know, the first test tube baby was born in England in 1978, but by 1986, there were IVF clinics opening in the Middle East, including in Egypt. So I went back and did my dissertation on this sort of plight of infertility for Egyptian women and their excitement and enthusiasm, if you will, over the coming of IVF to the country. And ever since then, I've been sort of following the new reproductive technologies that have been born because of IVF. IVF was the platform technology, and there have been so many other technologies that have arisen from IVF, and egg freezing is the newest one, if you will. And so I've done a lot of studies along the way, mostly in the Middle East, but this study on egg freezing is really my first study with a cross section of American women who had used the technology already. So I interviewed 150 American women who had done at least one cycle of egg freezing. And that's really the basis of this big study and the book that I wrote.
Since we are already talking about your book, I haven't read the full book, but I read through it and we talked about it and I read about it. So could you explain to our listeners the concept of mating gap and why it's central to egg freezing?
Yeah, so to just talk a little bit about the study, I wrote a grant proposal for the U.S. National Science Foundation. And the assumption, all the literature and all the media were assuming at the time that egg freezing was about educational and career planning. So that was really my main hypothesis. Women will be motivated to freeze their eggs for educational and career planning purposes. But I did add a kind of alternative hypothesis saying there may be other reasons why women are turning to egg freezing. It could be financial, relational, let's keep open, possibilities. And I started interviewing women. They were all educated, and we can talk about that. Educated women who had the economic means to do egg freezing because it's a very expensive technology. And by about 10 interviews in, it was like, wow, it's not about educational and career planning. Every woman is telling me the reason she's freezing her eggs is because she's reached the age of at least the mid 30s and she does not have a partner. She assumed that by this time she would be a married mother of children by her mid 30s, but it didn't work out that way. She's, either single, or there were a lot of women who had come out of relationships, breakups, divorces, long relationships that had broken up, broken engagements, relationships that didn't work out. And they found themselves in their mid to late 30s with no partner and no children. And that had always been a dream for most of these women, to be a mom. So, I kept going, and I learned, as you said in your introduction, that 82% of the women I interviewed were doing egg freezing single. They were there, because they didn't have a partner. And there was a bit of panic about, like, how am I going to be a mom? I don't have a
My
partner.
clock is running off.
What do
Yeah,
I do? And I've reached this age where my biological clock is ticking, ticking, ticking. So, women who would do this and invest in a very expensive technology, it can cost anywhere between $10,000 and $20,000 to do one cycle, depending on how many medications you need, and it's very expensive. And so those motivated to do this, they want what I called the three Ps. They were hoping for partnership, pregnancy, and parenthood. Women who wanted to experience physical pregnancy and they wanted to do it with their own eggs. They wanted to have some biogenetic connection to their children and they wanted to be moms. They wanted to be parents, but they wanted to do it partnered, right? That was really the dilemma and the sort of tragedy I found in the study is that these were women who really wanted to be in a heterosexual, happy, equal relationship with a man. And what they were lacking was what I called the three E's: an eligible, educated, equal male partner. So the mating gap is really about women wanting the three P's: partnership, pregnancy, and parenthood, but they're lacking, unable to find men who are eligible, educated, and equal, who make them feel supported, loved in a kind of equal relationship. And there's an underlying educational reality to this that we can talk about too. But basically, the mating gap was just about not finding that mate to sort of uphold the dream of a kind of stable reproductive partnership and family.
especially for these women that had the funds, to freeze
Yeah.
their eggs and who were educated themselves. So you said all of these women had higher degree education And so the mating gap, when we talked last time, you told me that in anthropology, historically, women, they want to marry up, and then men, they want to marry down. So with the term that kept coming up, you mentioned, was women don't want to settle. So we have this notion on one hand that women don't want to settle for a lower level partner to raise children with, but then on the other hand, they have this clock ticking and telling them you have to do it kind of now or sooner because in 5 years you no longer will be able to conceive a baby. So could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so traditionally around the world, I mean, it's not just in the United States, traditionally we have these, I'm going to call them retrogressive or outdated gender norms about mating, really. And so in anthropology, we have these two terms: hypergamy, which is mating up or marrying up, and hypogamy, which is marrying down. And traditionally around the world, women are supposed to engage in hypergamy, mating up to somebody who's usually slightly older, maybe more professionally settled, makes more money, that could be the male breadwinner for the family, could take care of a wife and children. And those are very traditional gender norms around the world. And I'm going to say they're still operating in the United States. There's this expectation of hypergamy. Similarly, for men, they're socialized around the world into hypogamy. So a slightly younger, fertile woman, a woman who may not have as much education, she may not be as professionally accomplished as the man. And so you find slightly older men marrying younger women who may not be on the same level. And so the notion of like relationship equality, where people are really kind of at the same educational, professional level, I mean, that's what I found women want. They want an equal, educated, eligible man who is comfortable with them and that they're comfortable with. And the problem is that women were not finding those kind of equal men, and they were not comfortable finding somebody less educated, maybe of a lower social class than they were. And similarly, they told me that men were not comfortable mating with a woman who was more educated, made more money, more successful, owned her own home. So men were intimidated by marrying up. Women felt they were settling if they married down. And so in those terms, it wasn't working, for these women. The women I interviewed were highly educated. About 20% had stopped at the bachelor's level. They completed their bachelor's degree, but 80% of them have gone on to get master's degrees, lawyers, MDs, MD, PhDs. It was a very highly educated group of women. And the underlying demography is not good. And it's not good in America. And it's not good in the UK. It's not good in more than 60% of nations around the world. Women are vastly outperforming men now in higher education. And this is something most people have no idea about. We don't talk about it. But basically, in America now, based on US Census data, there are more than 30% more women in higher education, in university education, than there are men. Men are slipping out of higher
Do we
education.
know why that is happening? Is that because it helps us with career, or is it because we need that external validation as well? I have friends who want to start their businesses, and I know men, they will just go and start it because they're good enough, and then women will go like, I'll first get an MBA and then I'll put my business plan together. That is
Yeah.
kind of, and I'm like, but you can start and do an MBA if you think your idea is good enough. But I feel like we need that extra accreditation to feel like we can do things. That is not scientifically based opinion. So that's why I'm
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, what I do know from the American data is that already in young ages, and by the time women and men get to high school, women are out achieving men now. Men are slipping educationally, which has become a kind of a cause for concern in the United States. It's been called the crisis of men and boys or wayward sons. Something's happening that boys are not getting the validation they need in school. So they're sort of slipping out, whereas girls are getting A pluses, they're doing well on standardized tests. So something's going on educationally where women are getting a lot of validation for doing well in school from young ages, okay? And so, by the time they get to university, there are just more of them going to university than men now. And this is found around the world, all over Western Europe, in Scandinavia. Actually, like the numbers, the percentage of women being, going to university at much higher numbers is pretty astounding, even in Scandinavia. You've got countries where there are like 38% more women in university now than men. So is it because women feel they need that education, to start their successful careers? That could be, that this is where they found success from a young age. And so they just kind of keep going and kind of keep thinking that they need to keep going in order to do well. But whatever the sort of underlying motivation is, women are doing well educationally. And I mean, I feel like we should celebrate that women are doing so well in, around the world, but they are outshining men in most countries now. And so men are not comfortable with that. I mean, I think that's really what I found in my study. Women talked about the I word, the intimidation word, that, they would go out on dates. And we can talk about online dating too, because almost every woman in my study had used online dating. And they were trying really hard, going out on so many dates. But it commonly was reported like you'd go out on a date, like a first date, and when the man asked you, well, where do you work? What do you do? And they'd find out that the woman had some sort of very great job and had gone to a nice university. They're like, men would say, wow, you're smarter than I am. We can't go out with each other. They'd make these sort of funny but
I
semi-misogynist
actually experienced
jokes.
this in US about 10 years ago. I haven't been on the dating market for a long time, but
Okay.
I have not experienced that in Europe. But when I was in US, I remember like, oh, you went to LSE or oh, you work for this company. I heard this kind of remarks, and I remember my own mother being from another generation, and she still tells me things like, you don't have to tell people that. She is a doctor and she will never put doctor, like, when you can choose your title for an airplane seat, or you can choose, she will never. And I'm like, but you are a doctor, you studied for so many, you got this because you earned it. And she's like, but people don't need to know that. She will play it down to feel accepted because that was her experience of life.
Yeah. And sadly, it's still happening. For me, if you read the prologue to my book, I talk about the story of one woman who I call Kayla, who was just having a horrible time out there in the world of dating and men. She had many male friends and nice brothers, but, the dating world was horrible for her. And she was a highly educated person, and she ended up going into the sort of world of biotech in California and, talking about just these problems of, finding men who were equal and, were intimidated by her. I mean, she was an engineer and she had all these credentials. And I said, for me, the sad part, reflecting on my own story, is I certainly saw that in my life of, going and getting a PhD, and, many of the women in my cohort didn't partner. Once they got their PhDs, they were having a very hard time finding partners who were comfortable with them. And like, oh no, this is still going on in this next generation of these remarkable women, that men are intimidated of them. But it was really true. I mean, many women did try to downplay their credentials, like you're saying. I mean, women wouldn't put their credentials on their dating apps. They wouldn't tell people, I have a PhD, or, this downplaying mode, because they knew that it was going to prevent people from even wanting to talk to them. And so that's not good. On the other hand, I mean, I think it works both ways where women, I would sometimes ask women, well, would you consider going out with somebody who wasn't educated or, had a nice job as an electrician or a plumber? And some women said, I just couldn't conceive of being with somebody who had never been to college. I mean, really? No college? It just probably wouldn't work. We'd have nothing in common. And so, there was a great book that came out before mine. It's called Datanomics, and it was written by an economic journalist named John Berger. And he really talked about these growing disparities educationally between men and women. And he calls it the college educated man deficit in America and the oversupply of university educated women. And he said, unfortunately, in the United States, classism is maybe even more powerful than racism in terms of dating here, that people just don't want to marry across class. I mean, we have certainly a lot of racism in our country, and so you often will find people who don't marry across racial categories, although that's changing, I'm going to say, for the better. But he says it's still, really a profound class-based issues in our society where
I
women,
think it's the same in Europe.
I think it's the same in the UK, and I think it's the same in Europe too. So you don't find what he called, and then I picked up his term in my book, mixed collar mating, where a white collar professional will commonly not marry a blue collar or working class person. Both ways, men not marrying down to women, as much, and women especially not marrying down to men from the working class. And so, but the problem is in the white collar community for women now, there simply are not enough educated men. So you've got this huge deficit in the millions where there are not enough educated men for the new class of educated women. And so in the prime reproductive years, in the 20s and 30s, there simply are not enough men. They are the missing men, the missing educated men. And so what are women going to do? There are not enough of them. Either they're just going to stay single and partnerless, or they're going to have to kind of rethink mating and possibly.
Exactly. Maybe we have to reevaluate the parameters by which we search our partner. And you've shared with me your personal um, mating or partner search, your marriage story. And I think you, as I understood, you've searched by different parameters. You looked for a friend, you looked for a support partner, you looked someone who can stand by your side, and that paid off for you in the long term. And actually then he became, also more higher educated. But probably even if he hasn't, these were not the qualities you were looking for at that moment. Maybe you can share your story with us.
Yeah, I mean, my first story is that I had in my 20s a long relationship that didn't work out. I did get married for a couple of years, and it was a disaster. He was an older man, and it didn't work out. And I came back from doing my dissertation field work, actually divorced, and I was in my early 30s. And for me, I knew that what I wanted more than anything was children. I always knew that from a very young age. I loved children, and I wanted to be a mom. So I actually contemplated being what's now called a single mother by choice or a solo mother by choice, of just like, well, if I don't find somebody, maybe I'm just going to use donor sperm and have kids. But then actually through an introduction in my very final year of my PhD, I met the person who was going to become my partner. And, we started dating. I actually told him, look, I'm probably not going to stay here. I'm going to try to get a job elsewhere. And I said, so I don't think we can stay together. He said, well, wait a second. I'm movable. I'd move for you. But the thing was, he had stopped college. He dropped out of college sort of in the middle of it. So he didn't have his uh, bachelor's. He didn't have a master's. He had also been through a divorce. And, so we came together. And the thing I could tell about him is that he was highly intelligent. He was very kind. And he had never contemplated fatherhood. He wasn't, in his previous relationship, they hadn't really talked about it. But I told him, I really want children. The one thing I want is children. And he said, well, I've never really contemplated it, but I'm not opposed to it. And so he actually came along with me on my journey. I got my first job at a big public university, and he went back to school. He got his bachelor's degree. And then I moved to another university. He got his master's degree. Eventually we came to Yale. He works at Yale. He's been working at Yale the entire time I've been working at Yale. He came along with me, and he never got to the level of education that I got my PhD and a master's degree, but he's got his master's degree. And, we've been together for 34 years. We have two children. So I chose somebody who in some senses wasn't equal to me educationally, but I took a chance, and it worked out. I mean, we've been together for a very long time. And so at the end of my book, I told that story in the beginning of my book. And at the end of my book, I really said, look at women, we're not going to be able to fix men. I mean, that's a term that one of my
No.
somebody in my study said, until we fix men. It's like, well, that's not our issue in some senses, but I think that women are going to have to really rethink partnership and to maybe, look at men who don't look so good on paper. As another woman in my study said, well, he doesn't look good on paper, but he's a great guy. There are really kind, wonderful men out there who for various reasons didn't have the opportunities to maybe go to university. Because in the United States, I just want to emphasize, why do people have trouble going to university here? It's really expensive to go to university.
Expensive. Yeah, it's expensive everywhere, I think, except Germany. So
Yeah,
it is very expensive. Just to, even if university is free, right? You still need to pay your rent and it's a trade-off between going to work and earning actual money or going to work part-time, which is difficult for many people.
yeah, and they
Um,
America, college admissions, university admissions went way down during the COVID period. And of that decline, 71% of the decline was among men. Why? They were trying to help their families just get through COVID. It was a really strange time. And what happened to women? There was a huge increased demand for egg freezing during the COVID period here because people were not out meeting, they weren't dating and mating. And so men were struggling to help out their families and make an earning, make a living. Women were struggling to figure out how they were going to be partnered and have children. And so we've gone through that. It was a real struggle and we've come out of that, but it's really the demand for egg freezing has continued to go up, I have to say, in our country. I mean, during the first decade of egg freezing, there was a 400% increase in demand in the United States, which says something I think rather profound.
and last time we talked to you, it was very interesting that your advice was not to go and freeze eggs between 20s and 30s. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of pressured advertising that's being directed at young women in their 20s to go freeze your eggs or have your parents give you egg freezing as a college graduation present. There's a lot of private market kind of, advertising trying to get young women to go freeze their eggs. In your 20s, your fertility, most women, their fertility is very stable and good. And so some, clinics will say, why don't you freeze your eggs when you're at your best peak fertility? But in your 20s, you know, your fertility is good and a lot of women will find a partner and they'll find their partner in their 20s. And so there's really no reason to kind of put 15 to $20,000 down in your 20s for eggs that you may never ever use. And also it is quite a process to go through egg freezing. We can talk about that. It is an invasive, intrusive bodily process, which is not pleasant to go through. So why would you put yourself through that in your 20s? Where I
So
think,
what, yes, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, where I think egg freezing starts to make sense is for women in their early 30s who know that they want to become mothers, but really see no partnership in sight. They don't have a partner. They don't know how they're going to get a partner. And they begin to worry about, their eggs and their reproductive timing. Unfortunately, biologically, women's fertility starts to decline around the age of 32 and age 35, it's called advanced maternal age, in OBGYN circles. By age 37, there is really a plummeting of women's fertility. It's called the fertility cliff, where fertility ovarian reserve, the quality and the quantity of eggs, really begins to decline around age 37. And by age 40, a woman has only about a 5% chance of conceiving naturally. So the 30s are really an important decade, if you will, for a woman's fertility. And so if I were in the situation of being in my early 30s, knowing I really wanted to have children, having no partner in sight, and if I had the money, I would start thinking about egg freezing in the early 30s. I mean, I think there's a little window of time sort of between age 32, age 35, age 37, which is the kind of window for egg freezing. And so that my recommendation would be, wait, don't do it in your 20s. But if you get to your early 30s and your situation is like, where is the partner? I want to have children. What am I going to do? And you have the money for it. I mean, that's the window for egg freezing in my view.
What do you think women considering egg freezing should ask themselves before taking this step? So, like, what is the process of thinking should be before going ahead to the clinic?
Yeah, I think that first of all, women need to sort of evaluate their motherhood desires. Is having a biogenetically related child and going through pregnancy with your own eggs really important to you? And, so that's the first question. And we know actually younger generations are really questioning even having children, and some women really are not going to want to, have kids and choose to be child free. So I feel egg freezing is for those who really hold out hope of becoming pregnant with their own eggs, and or just want to hold open that possibility down the road. So that's the first thing. You have to have the means to do it. And I think the unfortunate thing about egg freezing is the high cost. It just prevents thousands, maybe millions of women around the world from even considering it because it's so expensive. In the US, the average cost, including the hormonal medications that you have to learn to inject into your own body, it's expensive. It's somewhere between 12, 15, $16,000 to do one cycle. And so
And then
you
there's ongoing costs, right, of keeping, storing the eggs frozen and upkeeping. So I
yeah,
know a lot of people who done that in their late 20s, and now a few years down the line, they say, "Oh, I cannot go out." And I'm like, "Why?" It's like, "I'm paying like 300 quid a month for my eggs, that's been eating out of my monthly budget." So
they figure that, in the US, it's between $500 and $1,500 a year to keep your eggs stored. And if you were going to store them for 10 years, you froze them at 30, you were going to use them at 40, you're talking about 5 to 15,000 more dollars that you've put in just to the storage of the eggs. And to go back and use them to get them rewarmed and fertilized and the embryos created is another $6,000. So if you kind of added that up, one cycle from start to finish would be about 30,000 US dollars. And unfortunately, women are told that they need to store about 20 eggs. That's a sort of golden number, is 20 eggs, which may not even work, by the way. I mean, it's not a fertility
I was
insurance.
gonna ask, yeah, what is the percentage? What is the success percentage from those stored eggs?
Yeah, it depends on your age and sort of the quality of the eggs that were stored. I actually don't want to say the statistics because I'm not exactly sure. It very much depends on sort of the age and quality of the eggs and the number that you get to store. So in my book, I will tell you, I did have women who were successful to have their frozen egg baby and it worked for them. But of the little, sort of tabulation that I did in my book, a lot of women, their frozen eggs didn't work for them, once they tried them. So it is not a foolproof guaranteed insurance policy. And also, it's hard to go through. I actually have a whole chapter on just the experience of going through egg freezing. You have to get these very powerful hormonal medications and learn how to self-inject them if you don't have a partner. And 20% of people are needle phobic, and so there's a lot of needle work in egg freezing. That
Wow.
you have to have somebody go with you. There's a little surgery under general anesthesia that happens in order to extract the eggs. And so it requires accompaniment. It requires really a month of life where you're going to the clinic to get your ovaries scanned. It's an invasive procedure that's not really pleasant. And a lot of women, came out of it saying, I felt like a badass. It took a lot of bravery to go through it, a lot of logistical planning to, and have your mom fly across country to be with you, during the procedure. And so it's not an easy process. And also in America, it's mostly done in IVF clinics where everyone's married, very married space. And so a lot of women really felt kind of lonely and isolated going through it, as the single woman, the kind of woman who didn't have the ring on her finger, going alone. So it's a difficult and expensive process. You need to think about that before you go through it. And if
I don't
you,
know if you have any research on this, but one of our guests who is we are speaking to later in the year, she mentioned, she had a baby through IVF process. She was not alone, she was married. But then once you become a mother, you have this full of hormones and you feel how your life has changed and she was feeling this so anticipated baby, it's supposed to be her golden baby. She's supposed to be so happy. She's went through all this pain and process and money to get to this point, and now she's upset and crying and depressed, and she doesn't even understand why she wanted it so much. So there is also this, right? That you think having a baby is the end, but it's not the end goal, right? It's just the beginning of a whole different.
it's the beginning of a long, trajectory with a lot of responsibility. And I want to speak about that in terms of egg freezing because the women who did it, and I will say that women who did it, everybody in my study of the women that I wrote about mostly in the book, they had done it already. They'd done the egg freezing. And for the most part, they were so glad they'd done it. After they'd done it, there were more than 90% of women had at least one positive thing to say about their experience. And a lot of women were just they said, I feel wildly and weirdly empowered. They were glad. It gave them peace of mind, took a huge sort of feeling of pressure off their shoulders, felt like they gave them time to sort of look around for men again. There were a lot of beneficial things that women spoke
Yeah,
about.
because you said the first thing you need to decide if you want children or you want to be child free. For example, I have a child now and I'm 31 and I can decide I don't want any more children. And I can be very happy with that decision. But 45 will come and I'll say, ooh, I want another one. I changed my mind, right? Well, there is no changing your mind at that point. The time has just went. So that kind of buys me a chance, to change my mind, right? It buys me freedom of choice that men have by nature and
Yes.
women don't.
Yes. And so egg freezing gives you the timing aspect. It is literally preserving and extending your reproductive time. As long as it does work in the end, you have literally given yourself more time. It's buying time. I called it a kind of reproductive suspension bridge because I ultimately argue, that women who are partnerless, they had always been waiting for that mate, that unicorn, that magical man to appear. They're sort of stuck in this reproductive waithood, waiting for this person. And so having the eggs frozen is a relief. It's this feeling like, oh my God, I gave myself a chance. I took control of my reproduction. It was very, technological optimism that I've done this for myself. The other thing women think about once they've frozen their eggs, and it was a discussion that almost everybody has with themselves. Well, if I don't find that partner, will I do it alone? Am I going to use my eggs to become a solo mom, to do it? And there were women in my study who made that decision. It's like, I didn't find the man. I'm 40 years old. I've given myself this time. I'm just going to do it. So I try to show all the different sort of options, that women have. Egg freezing can lead to single motherhood with a frozen egg baby. There were some women who did find their mates and went on to have a frozen egg baby. There were some women who found their mates, tried to use their frozen eggs, and the frozen eggs didn't work, and it was a real disappointment. And there were just a lot of women who felt the relief of having frozen their eggs and put them into the bank and were still looking for that partner. And, some women who just didn't find the partner, So I have a variety of stories in the book showing the many different things that can happen with egg freezing. It's not a panacea.
It does. It is a great empowerment too, as you said. I think still everybody's preference to find a partner and to do it in a natural way. But then it's like a good safety net to fall on if
Yeah,
you
and
can
we
afford it. It's
and we
yeah.
know that there is this new movement in the US and in Western Europe and other parts of Australia of women just saying, I didn't find the partner, I'm going to do it on my own. That's a big decision, though, because again, you have to have the economic wherewithal to do it. You have to have a supportive environment. You have to have childcare. Doing that, making that option takes a lot of thinking for women too. But I definitely talked to many women in my study who were seriously thinking about that, were on their way to, had done it, were on their way to doing it, were seriously thinking about it, because that is another thing. Egg freezing gives you that little reprieve, that time to think through, is that something I can do? Get myself ready to do that in case I don't find somebody.
Would you call egg freezing a feminist technology?
I wrote a whole chapter on that. When it came out, it was being called a reproductive revolution, kind of like the birth control pill. Well, the birth control pill does not cost the amount that egg freezing costs. I mean, it's never going to be a reproductive revolution unless the price comes way, way down. And I think for me, the biggest feminist critique of egg freezing is the intersectional one, that it basically provides a choice and an option for women who are educated and have money, and it does not provide a choice or option for the many people who will never, ever be able to afford it. So it's very exclusionary technology. It really promotes the reproduction of a certain class of people, an elite class of people, and it certainly doesn't offer anything for people who can't, middle class and lower class people who will never be able to afford it. So that's the problem. Having said that, for those who are able to use it and can choose it, it does provide a new choice, a new option, a new way of preserving fertility. And so it does help to achieve the goal of reproductive justice, which is defined as the right not to have children, the right to have children, and the right to parent children in safe and dignified environments. And I did have women in my study, from different ethnic backgrounds. I had women from what we call in America underrepresented minority populations, Black and Latino women who were saying, I want this to be an option for Black women. I want this to be an option for Latinas because we face the mating gap too. And we want to have the option of preserving and extending our fertility.
You actually
Yes.
mentioned that the mating gap is even bigger in these societies. So women are far more faster, and more educated in minority groups in the US than white women. Is that correct?
Yes. So Black, Latina, actually all ethnic groups of women, all racial categories of women in the U.S. are more educated than the men in their racial
And they
category.
were, yes.
But disparities have been huger for, say, Black women. Black women in America are much more educated than Black men. Latina women are much more educated than Latino men. And so the educational disparities are larger within those groups. But, even the most educated group of people, Asians in America, Asian Americans, Asian American women are more educated than Asian American men. So women are just doing better than the men in their racial categories. But I had like Black feminist scholars were the ones to really define reproductive justice and what that means. And I had some very strong advocates, in the Black women in my study saying, we need this technology for Black women. We face a mating gap, something like 60% of Black women will not marry in America. They can't find partners. And that has to do with not only educational disparities, but, Black men in America are incarcerated at much higher rates than, white men are. And so there are real disparities in partnership that, have to do with a lot of profound social factors in our society. And so egg freezing for minority women serves a kind of important purpose of being able to have children. And so Black educated women in my study were real advocates of this technology and wished that it were more available to other Black women. So is it a feminist technology? I ended up saying I called it ambivalent feminism because on the one hand, a lot of feminist scholars feel very ambivalent about egg freezing as a technology, just as they did back in the old days when IVF came into the world. They were very ambivalent about IVF. So there's ambivalence from a sort of feminist community of scholars. And a lot of women in my study, even though they said, I want gender equality, I've been raised into gender equality, that's what I want at home and at work. But am I a feminist? They had a lot of difficulty accepting the feminist label, which was very interesting. So the women themselves felt sort of ambivalent about claiming feminism
I
for
think
themselves.
it's a very negative negative term somehow. It shouldn't be, but it became it. Yeah, it definitely became a negative term.
Yes. It's been shown in
But
Europe. Great book on feminism in Europe saying that younger women in Europe have a real hard time claiming the feminist label. Yes. Unfortunately for me as a feminist.
it's like, so for me at some point I thought feminist is someone who doesn't want their car door opened by a man because it diminishes them, and in some way we had some awful lawsuits going about, women saying that their rights have been deprived because men have been nice to them. There is this at the moment in society, just the norms are changing, and there's a lot of gray area of what's right and wrong. I told you this before, but I think equality is not something we'll ever get, because when I had a child, and that's the reason for having this podcast, I was like, what equality? Like, my boobs are leaking, I'm hormonal, I have blood going through me
Yeah.
like in liters, I can't sleep. I mean, we'll never be equal. You didn't go through what I went through. We need equity, right? We need and probably freezing eggs gives you a piece of that equity because it buys you that time and more than equality. At least you have that choice terms, but still they are very limited, right? You cannot use your eggs at 60, can you? I don't
No,
know.
no, no. So this is, egg freezing is not the solution to everything you're just talking about, and the biological differences between men.
It's tiny piece that can help you buy a bit more time to
Yes.
get to your equity, but
Yeah,
it
exactly.
still prolongs it a few years. So 5, 10 years, how long, how much
Yeah,
time does that buy you?
in the United States, and this is really interesting, in the United States, we don't have a national assisted reproductive technology law. There's no ART or IVF law of any kind in our country, which is very different from, say, the United Kingdom, where there's been a lot of national, decision making about what's, required and allowed. So in America, every IVF clinic kind of comes up with its own decision about how long women can store their frozen eggs. And what I learned from women at different IVF clinics who've done it in different parts of America, the decision has been keep the eggs up until the time of menopause, which is defined between 50 and 52 years. And so women, when they do the egg freezing, they have to sign a lot of consent forms. And one of them is, what happens at age 51, we will no longer store your eggs. What do you wish to do with your frozen eggs? And they're given three choices: disposal, destroy the eggs, donate to science. There's a donation to science, which is what most women in the study chose, or donate to known others. Um, for most women, the eggs are too old to be part of sort of open donation egg donor programs, but they can write that they would like to donate their eggs to other people. And so some women had, for example, sisters or a friend or somebody that they wanted to designate as a, donor recipient. But most women just said, donate to science. A lot of women actually said, I'd like my eggs to be used for stem cell research. They were very specific. But so you're given basically up till 50, 51, 52 to store your eggs. And a lot of women said, like, do I want to be a mom at 50, 51, 52? I think I'm going to give myself a deadline. I used to say it was 35. Well, that's gone, maybe 40. Well, maybe 40 is only 5 years from now. Well, maybe 42. They were kind of kept moving the deadline farther and farther down the road.
So scary.
45 and, for me. So it was really an interesting discussion about how when you don't have a partner, you keep moving the deadline for your motherhood. In some countries, the national law, gives you only till age 40 or till age 42 or to age 45. But
That's
we don't have
crazy.
in America. Yeah. But those kind of laws put women under incredible pressure. They froze their eggs at 5. They've got 5 years to figure it out, and so that's the problem with laws that only give you a certain window of time.
And how do you think this technology will change in the near future? What do we see in reproductive health? What changes are coming?
Yeah, I think that, first of all, in vitro fertilization, my colleague at Cambridge, Professor Sarah Franklin, has written extensively about IVF, and she called it the platform technology. It's been the platform for so many other technologies and add-on technologies. And if we never had IVF, we would have never gotten to egg freezing. Egg freezing was the final frontier, if you will, of so-called cryopreservation. We've been able technically to freeze sperm and embryos for a very long time, but it took a very long time to figure out how to successfully freeze eggs, because eggs are the largest cell in the human body and they're watery, and they would try to freeze the eggs, but they would crystallize and fragment. And it took a long time to figure out the new freezing technology called vitrification.
Is
So
it
there is,
because it's so hard, or is it because men have been the subject of health and studies for the majority of modern medicine and women just haven't been the focus?
yeah, I mean, that's true. We know that in science, men have always been the sort of model population for clinical trials and things. I think with egg freezing, it was just technically difficult because they used this sort of
Okay.
low freezing method and it just wasn't working. And finally, actually, in Japan is where they did the experimentation to come up with a new fast flash freezing called vitrification that finally worked and was successful for eggs. So that's been like the newest thing. It happened in the aughts, in the early 2000s, and once it got going, it's been very rapid. But they're trying other things. For people who just don't have good eggs or don't have eggs, don't make sperm. There's a new thing called IVF gametogenesis, where they're actually trying to produce viable, sex cells, egg and sperm from other human cells, from stem cells, from skin
Wow,
cells, for people who are born or have a problem in the production of healthy egg and sperm. So who knows if that will eventually come to pass down the road. I mean, reproductive cloning has happened in mammals, in sheep and so forth. There's going to be a lot more technological innovation coming down the road. For egg freezing, I mean, the one thing that could happen for the good would be if somehow the price were brought down, or health insurance coverage for egg freezing. And that's really beginning in the United States. It started in big tech back in like 2013, 2014. Some of the big tech firms started offering egg freezing as part of the health insurance
benefit. Yeah,
fertility benefit package. And there were women in my study who actually fought for that because it really made them mad that married women who were infertile and needed IVF in their companies, the fertility benefits offered by health insurance in the company offered 4 cycles of IVF for married employees. And so, single women who were figuring out what to do, it's like, why do my married colleagues get 4 cycles of IVF? And I'm trying to prevent myself from being infertile through egg freezing, and it's not covered. So there was a lot of activism actually within big tech to get health insurance coverage, and that's expanded in the US over time. It's known that about 19% of Fortune 500 companies, big companies in America, are now offering egg freezing through their health insurance plans.
that's great.
And we'll see if that increases over time. And so what that is leading to is younger women starting to freeze their eggs because they have health insurance coverage. And I actually spoke to a reporter from the New York Times who said, our New York Times is offering it now. And so a whole bunch of us, slightly younger women, late 20s, early 30s, just decided to freeze our eggs. It's here. We have the coverage. Why not do it? So I think health insurance coverage in America will expand over time, giving more women who might not have been able to afford it the opportunity to freeze their eggs. And so
And
until
essentially, it's good for the companies, right? Because then women can focus on work for the few years while they're socially active and probably not leave on the mat leave, right?
Yeah, and so that was the critique, the sort of feminist critique is like, oh my God, the tech firms and these big companies are just telling women, freeze your eggs so that you can work like a dog for another 10 years for our company. A lot of women who were working in tech that I interviewed for my study were very affronted. They felt that critique was unfair, that they weren't doing it to like be slaves to their company. They were doing it because they were of the age where they knew their biological clock was ticking and they hadn't found partners. And they said, thank God I work for Apple. Thank God I work for Google because I could do it. It was covered and I didn't have to worry about coming up with the money. And a lot of other women in my study said, I wish I worked for Apple. Who wouldn't want to work for Apple and get $30,000 of egg freezing coverage, So there are two sides to that story, I think that health insurance is just really important. And unfortunately, in America, a lot of people do not have good health insurance. And even under Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, it doesn't cover any of this stuff. It doesn't cover IVF. It doesn't cover egg freezing. It's basic coverage. So America is not we're a private fee-for-service country. We do not have national health insurance, and it does a great disservice to a lot of people who just don't have good health insurance, unfortunately.
Well, hopefully, as women, listen to this podcast and what you just said, and they will speak up more to their companies and insurances and maybe even the government, then we'll see the change, because this change will not come from men. It's women, taking their house into their own hands and
And
demanding.
I don't think Obama gave us Obamacare, the ACA, which is really important for many, many families. I don't expect anything positive reproductively in the Trump administration, which is a huge cost.
We are talking abortion, right, being canceled, and yeah,
Abortion,
we are.
embryos, IVF, contraception, it's all up for discussion. And it's a really scary time for women, I think, for young women and for men too, Yeah. It's going to be a very interesting period of time in our country, unfortunately.
And it feels like the world is right now that layered piece where we are sort of in 3,000 year mentality, where we are freezing eggs and talking tolerance and talking, equity and talking about taking care of the planet. And then there's this other layer which is very extremist. We burn forests, we ban abortion. So it feels very, very split and aggressive in both directions at the same time.
Yeah, I
So,
agree. On the one hand, I see so much progress in the world. And for me, celebrating women, and all that they've achieved educationally, economically is really important. And I really have to say, I thank all the women who had the courage to speak with me about their journeys. They were a very, to me, remarkable set of women and, who had done things and were passionate about their careers and lives, and also were passionate about wanting to be a mom. And so I just applaud and I understand deeply their desires for that, which I really have to say, having been in that situation myself of deeply desiring a family, I really feel for people who are trying that and are having problems, whether they're infertile or they don't have a partner or they have actually a medical condition. I interviewed people who were freezing their eggs medically because they were facing cancer and other really dire reproductive problems. And I really acknowledge the desire that people to want to have kids. But I also recognize, and we know this from a lot of research now, a lot of young people are really questioning having children, questioning whether they should do it at all for the sake of the children in a world that seems like it's falling apart. We've got climate change, we've got forest fires, we don't have gender equality, we still have patriarchy. Heterosexuality doesn't seem to be working very well for either women or men, really. And so there's a lot of questioning going on and people saying, do I really want to bring kids into the world? Maybe not. And I have at least a daughter who feels that way. She just doesn't think she wants to ever have children. And I respect that too. We need to respect what's called child-free living. And I often have said in my work on infertility, that if you can't have a child, you need to make peace with that and find other ways to be child-free happily, within a partnership. There are other ways of living and other ways of having children too, through adoption, through fostering, through being a great aunt or uncle to your nieces and nephews. We need to reframe the whole traditional heteronormative family. And so, there's a lot that we need to think about. And so I agree with you. In some ways, we're moving forward so rapidly, it seems, with technology, AI, chat GPT, all these things. And on the other hand, sometimes we're living in very retrogressive kind of gender norms, that are still hurting people. So, we need to figure it out. We're in a very divided political landscape with very progressive people and very conservative people. We see that happening all over the world.
all over
So,
the world.
all over the world, yeah.
And I think it means trouble for women usually in the end.
Yeah.
I have
If
a
we had
few more questions. Yeah, tell me.
more women in leadership positions all around the world, we'd be in a much better place. Let's face it.
Oh, I agree with you 100%. All the wars, I mean, I think predominantly our audience are mothers, but I always think if a mother was a president, there would be no war. There would be dots, like there would be no wars. Like this would just not happen because once you've given a life to someone, or at least you've been in this process, right? And you know how hard it is to get to the point to give someone a life. You would never risk other people's lives. You would
No,
just not. No.
you would want them to go to war, and you would not want other young people to be killed in war. Yeah, I agree with you. Pacifist, I have to say, I strongly believe that. It would be a much more peaceful world.
Your personal reflections on navigating career and motherhood.
It's a challenge for every woman, I think, to navigate the fine line between, having a career that upholds you and uplifts you and you feel passionate about, and also having children and a family life that you also feel upheld and uplifted by and passionate about. And I think I was personally very fortunate. I've been able to, I guess you would say, have it all, although I never really think in those terms. But, I was able to do both, and feel I was able to pick a career that I truly love. I really found my passion. I am a medical anthropologist and feminist scholar, and I'm a scholar of the Middle East. And I've been able to have a really rewarding career. And in part because I've been uplifted by my partner, I found a partner who really kind of understood me and what I wanted to do in my life. And he traveled with me all over the world. I've lived with my family in 3 different Middle Eastern countries. And it's really broadened my own children's outlook and perspective on life and on the world. But I did that because I had a person, a mixed collar marriage with somebody who was willing to sort of sacrifice for me. And so that is something important in my own story. And I've also worked for employers that did or didn't understand my desire to have children. I always put that out there in when I would go for a job interview, that I had a reproductive agenda, that I wanted to have children, and I was always asking about maternity leave or family leave um, processes at the places that I've worked. I just always put it out there. I didn't hide it. And so it sort of forced people to talk about it. And I'm going to
This
say
should
that
be normalized. Like this should be told to women like up front. It's definitely will come up. So why don't put it like as as part of job? This should be normalized on my LinkedIn. Although I'm very client faced and I have my own company, we manufacture condiments in the UK. My LinkedIn profile says proud mom, business owner. Like I am a mom. It's my job. If my kids are sick, it's normal. It would be strange if I wouldn't do it. There would be something fundamentally wrong with me if I wouldn't prioritize my child's health. It doesn't
abs-
mean my yeah.
absolutely, like, why does one have to preclude the other, right? But I was told by older faculty, what before I went out on the academic job market, never say anything. And if you're pregnant, never try to hide the pregnancy. And I was just like, no, 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 no. This is something I really want, and I've worked hard for this. I am not going to hide this, and I'm going to ask about it, and I'm going to ask what the provisions are in the workplace. And there were times, I'm going to say, when it was held against me, and it really was in one of my jobs, actually during my childbearing years, and I did contest it. And I have always upheld my junior colleagues and graduate students' rights and desires to have children. They call me Anthromom, which is a great credit, I feel, to me, because they know I'm a mom and they know that I support all moms, and men too having children. And I unfortunately, some of my graduate students have faced pregnancy discrimination, and I've, stood up for them. So it really matters to me. The sad part is that people are still facing pregnancy discrimination or maternal discrimination in the
Well,
workplace.
I was pregnant in my university, so during the 3rd year, and I was told by professors, quit, leave, come back in a couple of years. You can't do it. You can't do it. I think people are really worried for our university being a prestige university that I will maybe skew the marks down or I will not secure the jobs. they expect us to secure. But I was like, I'm not leaving. I'm doing both.
Good
Like
for you.
I'll handle it. Yeah, but I was asked to leave by many people.
That is
And
just very disappointing that faculty, that academics would do that. And I'm going to tell you, a lot of male faculty members have always had children and families, and often it's the partner that does most of that work. That's a very old school way of thinking, and I'm really sorry to hear that you went through that. And unfortunately, I've had experience with my graduate students that some people have very retrogressive ideas about that. I went through all of that, all of the childbearing, and all of the reproductive. I had very hard start to my reproductive life. I did all of that while a young academic, a young professor, and I got through it, with the support of my partner and with the support of some people. But there were some very unsupportive people along the way too. So we need to change workplaces. Like, get with it. Women can be reproductive and also be very productive workers. Like, face the music. Women can do
for
this.
that, we need support. We need support at home. We need understanding partners. We need understanding coworkers. That doesn't mean they need to take our workload. It just means, that we'll work differently.
Yeah.
And there needs to be like all people that work in my company, they can leave to pick up their kids from school and then come back and finish. And I trust them. There's this trust level. I know that they will deliver. They know that I will pick up in my own hours. And we also know if it's a client meeting, we'll be there and somebody will take care of the kids. It's just that level, I think, of autonomy and trust and support wherever we are that we need to have in place.
Yeah, you're building this into your workplace culture, so it needs to be built in and made possible. And in America, we just don't have good national maternity leave laws, or family leave. We don't. We really don't. You get 12 weeks and a lot of it's unpaid leave. So that's just, we're behind other countries, really far behind, so yeah, there need to be policies on a national level. There need to be, state policies. There need to be company policies to make it possible for women to be both good workers and good parents, and for men too. Men need to participate. They need to be part of the planning, the policies, and the actual enactment of good parenting.
I mean, this landscape has changed a lot in the recent years. What would you say, at least in your field, like graduate field, you said, or postgraduate field? Um, what changed, like for women in terms of motherhood? You said more people voice that now, but also from the company's perspective, like what changes can you observe now throughout your years?
Well, I think there's been a lot of progressive movement toward making sure that people, at least in academia, do get some sort of a paid leave, for maternity and paternity. A lot of employers in universities are acknowledging that men need to be part of it too. There's been a movement toward, sponsored childcare options that are childcare or daycare centers that are connected to companies, to universities, because you need to have good childcare. I mean, it's just absolutely, you need to know that when you're working, your child is in a safe and healthy,
There is
child.
no paid childcare, like free childcare in the UK until your child turns 2.5. And that has been such a puzzle for me because I was like, I cannot have a maternity leave, but I have to pay to go back to work more probably than an average woman earns to
Yeah.
put my child for 2.5 years. And if I don't do it, I'll be out of the workforce because I'll no longer have the skills and nobody will want to hire me. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna do my own thing. And I started my business. But I was like, there is
Yeah.
what do you do, without childcare?
It's even longer in the US. I mean, we don't really have paid for childcare. We don't until a child goes to public school, which is kindergarten. So they're already 5 years old. People cobble together childcare for about 5 years of their child's life. And so that's not good. But at least there's some discussion about getting childcare facilities in places that, people convenient to workplaces and that sort of thing. So we just have a very long way to go to really support work-life balance. And that's why there was this feminist critique against egg freezing early on to say, like, this is structural. This is, structural feminist critique. Like, you need to do so many more things to help women be good workers. It shouldn't be that they have to go and freeze their eggs for the company. Companies need to provide good leave policies, good childcare provisions. We need to start with the kinds of things that are going to support women in the workplace and lead to what we would call work-life balance, so that you can do both things, and that women don't have to like delay, defer, and postpone their childbearing for the company. And so that was a very ardent critique. It maybe wasn't right about what the reasons for egg freezing were. I mean, it didn't understand, I think, that critique, but
One
women,
is one does
yeah,
not one does
preclude.
not cancel the other one. Yeah.
And maybe if we supported men in many more different ways, they would be there as better ready partners to women. For women, it was like the unready men. These men don't seem ready to partner. They're fearful. They don't think they can support a family. They don't know that they want to have children. Like, I
I
guess
mean,
what we,
I was gonna wrap up, but this, when you told me that in Black and Latino communities, women are far more educated than men, I was not surprised to hear that. And I see that also like in my minority, Eastern European communities, women are by far ahead of men. I'm sorry to all the boys that listen to me, but I'm a mother of a boy, and I am terrified because I don't know how to raise him. And even now, I see that he's kind of behind the girls. You see that especially at age 9, 10, girls are much more like settled and organized and academic, and he's just not there. And I'm like, what do I
he's
do? How do I raise him?
he's a wonder. I'm sure he's going to be raised by a feminist mom to be a very feminist, nice young man, as I feel I have done for my son. I have a son and I have a daughter. And but this issue of boys just not maturing as quickly as girls is one that's being taken up in the world of education. In parts of Scandinavia, they're having serious discussions about starting boys in kindergarten later at an older age than girls, because girls their brains, they seem to mature just more quickly than boys do. And because boys start like not being equal in school early on, a lot of boys get discouraged and they eventually no longer like school. And there are a lot of women
I heard
teachers.
that when I was choosing schools, in England you have boys' schools and girls' schools, and I decided to put my son in a mixed school. But now, 10 years later, I would have chosen a boys only school for that reason, because I can see he's competitive. He wants to be good academically, but girls are just better. So then at some point they go like, well, I'll never be good enough. So I'll just
Yeah,
focus on football.
yeah, I should just not try anymore and I'll do sports. And
Yeah.
the boys start falling out of education in massive numbers. And so that's really the issue that's being called the crisis of men and boys. In America, there was a great report from Massachusetts Institute of Technology called Wayward Sons. And it really said it's the minority male now who excels at the highest levels of achievement and goes on to be, great in the job market, great in education. That's the minority of men. The average American male is slipping out of education and job markets, is just slipping downward. And we need to do something about it. And it needs to start early in education so that boys don't get discouraged. They don't hate school. They don't drop out. They don't want to go to college. All of those things that we see happening. And it's not just minority men, it's all men in America. It's white men, Black men, Latino, indigenous men. Even Asian American men and women are the most highly educated group in America, but even there are disparities where women are doing better than boys, so something's going on with education that we need to really be talking about. So your son is just experiencing what a lot of boys are experiencing in education, and so that's being talked about at least. I don't know exactly how to fix that issue, but it does need to be resolved so that boys
Yeah.
feel that they want to keep achieving educationally.
What advice would you give to younger women?
I would say, look, you may not find the perfect partner. You may not find this, that, women said the unicorn, this magical man. And then they often said that man doesn't exist. There aren't magic men out there. If you find one, you're really, really lucky. So, if you're heterosexual and you feel like you want to be with a man, give it your best, give it a go. But if you don't find that person, you can still have a satisfying life. And I think the big movement, the new phenomenon, is women just deciding to be moms of their children without the man in the picture. And women finding new ways to have really rewarding lives by, for example, partnering with other women who are in the same situation, and basically sometimes buying houses together, getting childcare together, figuring out other ways of doing family life that maybe doesn't involve a heterosexual relationship. And we do know that there's
That
already
sounds great.
other ways of doing families, right? We know already that there are so many of these women who've decided to have children on their own. And there's a new movement of women who've used the same anonymous sperm donor, of finding the other women who also chose that sperm donor and meeting them, and so that their children get to know their biological half siblings. And there's a wonderful two
Very
books
cool.
out. Colleague Rosanna Hertz. You should really interview her for your podcast. She's done two studies, one of the single mothers who had their children, and then the second book is called Random Families, about how those women found the other women who's the same sperm donor, and they're making families with the children. They're going on summer vacation together. They meet, twice a year, so that their children know that they have these cool half brothers and half sisters. So it's a whole new world. It's a new reproductive world out there.
That's
And so,
beautiful. I mean, I am a single mother, and having made, friends with other moms when my son went to kindergarten, that was my family. That I understand that very well. That, we went on vacations together. There were other divorced women, or we were a pack. And I think especially those early years, you need a pack. You're going through a lot of hormonal changes, and women understand what you're going through. So I think somehow I might have been more supported than actually women in
a partnership.
traditional family scenario.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that is something that women don't fret. If you're a young woman, look for your partner if that's what you want. If you don't find it, there are other ways of having wonderful sort of family lives. And I'm going to say too that, LGBTQ, people are finding their voices and their sexual identities. There are way more young people, saying that they're bisexual than back in the early days. And so that's a shifting gender norm as well. And so it may not be a man that you find in a traditional heterosexual partnership. It may be a woman. You may have a different way of making a family. So I think there's just a lot of new things happening in the world that that really speak to beyond the boundaries of the
Like look for your person, right? And then what status that person comes into doesn't really matter.
yeah. And there are many ways of creating a meaningful family that go beyond the traditional heteronormative family. I think that's really true in this 21st century. And I think don't give up. If you want a family, there are other ways of doing it.
You did say that you don't like saying having it all, but we sum up our episodes asking everyone, what did you think it means for a woman to have it all?
I think for me, I guess I'm going to say, for me, having it all means having a career of some sort of a work that is meaningful and feels, good to you, that you're happy doing it. You're happy to be in a work environment. You feel supported and you enjoy your work. And if you want a family and you want to have children, that was your life goal and a desire and a deep set desire, that you can do both of those things at the same time. I mean, and I was able to do that. It was a hard struggle. I had really hard reproductive struggle, which I describe in my book. And I found a partner who, wasn't this unicorn person who was exactly the same as I was, but was a really good life partner for me. And so I've been having a family. I got 2 children, which is what I wanted. And I've had a career that I feel very passionate about. And I've been able to do it all at the same time without neglecting my children. I always check in with them like, did you know I was working really hard when you were little? It's like, no, mom, you were always there for us. We knew you liked your job, but no, we never felt neglected. So for me, having it all was a kind of work I really loved, and that was able to involve travel to very interesting parts of the world with my family, but also having a family that I love very much. So, and now I have to say, now that my children are grown and no longer live with me and my partner, with my husband, having it all is also having health, being able to travel to places that are interesting to me. It's a different phase of life that we don't talk
But
much
it's an
about.
outcome. It's an outcome of your life prior to that, right? You can travel so much because you had the education, you have the financial freedom to do so. That's something you've invested in through the years. So,
But able to do that and to be healthy. I will say, on your broadcast, I've been struggling through 3 years of cancer, and so
I'm so
having
sorry.
remission. And as you get older, you realize, and actually even younger, because egg freezing, I interviewed young people with cancer. Having good health is a privilege that a lot of people don't have. And so having it all is also being healthy, and having health care and having good quality health care is something that we can't, it's a privilege and a priority. So all of these things are part of having it all that, we can't take for granted. You can't take these things for granted. You may not get your life partner, and if that happens, find other ways to find a fulfilling life. And a lot of people don't get work that really is meaningful to them. And so if that's true, find other things that make life meaningful for you. I mean, I don't think there's a perfect life. There is no perfection. One can have a
That's what we
good.
were sold, right? Disney, the prince, the dress, the perfect body. And I guess maybe it's taking away those expectations
Yeah,
and finding what's right for you. Because you said, I knew what I hear from you, you were right. I knew I wanted to have the children. I got it. I wanted to be an anthropologist. You went to be a journalist, but then you pivoted to be an
yes.
anthropologist. You married. It was wrong person. You went and you got the right person. So maybe it's never too late to really go for what you want, even if
Yeah,
it's not what it seems in the beginning.
yeah, making adjustments, just like if this doesn't work, be honest with yourself. Don't hang in something for a very long, long time that's not working for you, and try your best to make your situation better. But I always tell my graduate students or my students, because they struggle. I think perfectionism is the bane of the existence for some people. There is no perfect, perfectionism is the worst enemy of the good, or the worst enemy of excellence. Just, there isn't a perfect life, but try your best to make yourself happy and fulfilled. I guess that's where I would end. That's all I
That's
have to.
beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy you're a guest on the podcast. I think it will be so meaningful for so many women, and I'm very, very happy to have you as a guest.
Thank you so much.